Hi everyone, today I'll be reviewing Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This book was published in 1938 and it remains popular today. When I first picked it up, I thought that Rebecca was the protagonist, but that's not the case. Actually, the protagonist is never named. So right away, without even opening the book, it felt like the author was playing with reader expectations. That sold the book for me. I decided to give it a read, and I'm glad that I did. Our unnamed protagonist, who is also the first-person narrator, turns out to be a shy and insecure young woman who works as a ladies' companion. A ladies' companion is basically a paid friend. While staying at a resort with her employer, our narrator runs into Maxim de Winter. Maxim is a wealthy English gentleman who owns a famous estate called Manderley. Maxim takes a liking to their narrator, who is some 20 years his junior. The interest is mutual, so when the narrator's employer decides that they'll leave the resort, the narrator panics because she has developed feelings for Maxim. So she decides that the best way to proceed is to barge into his hotel room. A very funny and kind of awkward marriage proposal ensues, and soon the new Mrs. de Winter is whisked off to Manderley in England. Unfortunately, not all is bliss from there. Rebecca, Maxim's first wife, seems to be a constant psychological presence at Manderley. It weighs down on the narrator more and more, culminating in a shocking twist to the story. So, what worked for me? First, even after the twist, you never feel like you have quite an understanding of who the main characters are, but in a good way. The narrator put it well when she said she had put up false pictures in her mind and sat before them. Portraiture is actually a major theme in the novel, and I really like how the author ties in the theme to her ambiguous depictions of the characters. The most obvious ambiguous portrait is that of Rebecca. A famous artist painted a portrait of her while she was still alive, but we never get to see it because Maxim didn't want to have it at Manderley. So we never actually know what Rebecca looked like. Because Rebecca is dead and the book is told through a first-person narrator, not only do we never get to see her, we also don't get to hear her perspective. Instead, we learn about her through physical objects like the decor at Manderley and character recollections of what she was like. But the people who knew Rebecca best can't be said to be objective about her at all. And on top of that, some of them might not be mentally stable. Also, as the story progresses, we learn that Rebecca herself kept secrets. So the things that we do learn about her, which to be fair, paint her in a negative light, aren't necessarily the whole truth. Another ambiguous portrait is that of Maxim. When the narrator first meets Maxim, she says that he reminds her of a portrait in a gallery of a certain gentleman unknown. Much of the book is filled with the author's fantasies about what Maxim thinks or feels. Eventually, she convinces herself that he sees her as a dog or a child rather than a wife. You could take that at face value, and you can even go further and say that Maxim is the villain of the story, in a sense that he might be lying and manipulating the narrator the entire time. On the other hand, there is evidence that Maxim does love the narrator, but you never really find out for sure. It seems that the narrator herself is aware of this tension and has a nightmare about it towards the end of the novel. Overall, the two major characters of the novel Maxim and Rebecca remain enigmatic to the end. I think that this is one of the strengths of the book, the way that it keeps you guessing. Another thing I liked about this book is how it explored two ways of living. One way is to dominate, to take from the world and not to conform to others' expectations. The other way is to be moderate, introspective, and to conform to society. The book has a lot of pretty flower imagery that ties into this theme of duality. For example, Maxim explains that many flowers are too wild to be put into vases because they resent civilization. Roses, however, are one of the few flowers that look better picked than growing. He compares roses to women with messy hair who improve when they are put inside the house. Throughout the book, roses are always associated with the narrator from the time that Maxim imagines her as a bride with a rose in her hand. The narrator's bedroom faces the rose garden, and she holds roses when she first starts feeling confident about herself. And like the rose, the narrator is domestic. She dreams about the peaceful life of a wife and mother, and she wants to be liked by everyone, even if it comes at great personal cost to herself. For example, there's one part of the book when she confesses that she would gladly give up her 5 senses if it ensured her a Maxim, peace, and security. By contrast, rhododendrons are associated with Rebecca. They're described as monsters with a slaughterous blood-red color. These flowers are in Rebecca's room, but they're not background decoration like the rest of the flowers in the house. Instead, they dominate the space, they overtake the room. Similarly, Rebecca dominates Manderley even after her death by the sheer force of her personality. So you read this and think, what is the author trying to portray with this duality, if anything? In my opinion, du Maurier seems to imply that too much passion and too much complacency are both destructive. You can compare the narrator's circumstances in the epilogue to those of Rebecca and see if you agree. So what didn't work for me about this book? The first issue is the pacing. The novel builds up the narrator's jealousy to the point where it gets too repetitive. Like, we get it. She's jealous of Rebecca. You don't need to hammer it in. At some point, each additional episode of jealousy feels like it doesn't add anything new and drags down the pacing of the story. In addition, the suspense elements, which might have helped out the pacing, are not very pronounced. The initial outline of the book shows that du Maurier tried to fix this. For example, she changed the name of Rebecca's boat from Gypsy to Je reviens, which means I will return. This adds more tension and foreboding, which does help with the pacing. Still, I think the suspense elements of the book are pretty weak, at least until the last third of the book or so. Another problem I saw with the book was the repetitiveness of the language. The worst offender for this was the dialogue. There are many times when a character says something, there's a dialogue tag, and the word is repeated again. Sometimes the character says basically the same sentence twice. For example, I had a dream, I said, a dream. What is it? He asked. I don't know, I said, I don't know. So these dialogue quirks are in almost every conversation, and they get progressively worse towards the end of the novel, so that at the end they're on almost every page and sometimes multiple times a page. I'm not sure what the author was trying to accomplish with this, but for me, it felt irritating. Overall, I thought that the pacing and the repetitive dialogue dragged down the quality of the story. This book is more complex and interesting than I initially expected. It's also quite dark. To be honest, this is one of the most depressing books that I have ever read. And I think the reason for that is that it sets up a typical Cinderella story, then it subverts that expectation in a really tragic way. Overall, I think this book is definitely worth reading, and despite its flaws, you will not easily forget Rebecca.